To understand why Puritans would restrict celebrations to the birth of Jesus Christ, I think you need to start with how Puritans came to exist in the first place. Henry VIII wanted a divorce. He was married to Catherine of Aragon, daughter of Queen Isabella and King Ferdinand of Spain, the same rulers who started the Spanish Inquisition and funded Christopher Columbus. Catherine was originally married to Henry's older brother Arthur, heir to the English throne. England was a Catholic nation at the time, and this marriage would help bind two powerful Catholic nations. They were married for about 5 months before Arthur died at the age of 15, making Henry the new heir to the throne. The families agreed that Catherine would now marry Henry. However, Catholic canon law forbade a man to marry his brother's widow. To get around this, the families requested and were granted special dispensation from the Pope. Henry initially rejected the marriage plan, only agreeing to the marriage on the death of his father in 1509. Soon after marriage, Catherine became pregnant. She gave birth in 1510, but the child was stillborn. She was once again pregnant 4 months later, giving birth to a son in January 1511, but this child would die just 7 weeks later. She had two more stillborn children in 1513 and 1516 before giving birth to her daughter Mary in 1516. During this time, Henry was having affairs with various mistresses, leading to at least one male bastard. Henry's family claim to the throne was through the female line, but only after a bloody civil war fought by his father, often referred to as the War of the Roses. It was unclear if a daughter would be able to inherit the throne, and almost certain it would be contested if a male heir, even a bastard, could also make a claim. By 1525, Catherine was 40 years of age and seemed unlikely to be able to have any more children. Henry seemed to believe that his marriage had been cursed because he married his brother's wife, and also he wanted to marry one of Catherine's ladies-in-waiting, a much younger woman by the name of Anne Boleyn. So at that time, Henry requested permission from the Pope to annul his marriage to Catherine. Henry was, by most accounts at this point, a fairly devout Catholic. He had even been given the title Defender of the Faith by Pope Leo X for a written defense he provided against the Protestant attacks on the Catholic Church. Catherine did not want a divorce, which placed the Pope in a difficult position. The marriage involved two powerful Catholic countries, and to add even more complexity, Catherine's nephew had recently sacked Rome, and the Pope was in his custody. With no good options, the Pope and Catholic authorities basically stalled giving a final response. For 7 years, petitions and hearings went back and forth on the matter, with no final response. Henry eventually got tired of waiting and took matters into his own hands. He banished Catherine from the court and married Anne Boleyn against the church's wishes in January of 1533. Catherine was formally stripped of her title as queen, and their daughter, Mary, was declared illegitimate. In September of 1533, Anne gave birth to a daughter, Elizabeth, but this was not the son that Henry wanted. In 1534, Henry convinced Parliament to declare that the king was, quote, the only supreme head on earth of the Church of England, effectively removing the Pope's authority over the Church of England and establishing himself as the head of church with no right to appeal to Rome. Those who opposed the charge were pilloried or even executed. But none of this solved the heir problem. By the winter of 1534, Henry was now openly expressing frustration with Anne Boleyn, both for her failure to give him a son, as well as just generally being unhappy with the marriage. Anne was, by all accounts, a very intelligent woman, but she had made enemies over the years at court. Catherine remained popular, and since attacks on the king himself were treasonous, Anne was an easier scapegoat. In 1536, Catherine died of what we now believe was cancer. However, rumors at the time were that she had been poisoned. Anne Boleyn was pregnant at the time of Catherine's death. However, literally on the day of Catherine's funeral in January of 1536, Anne miscarried what would have been Henry's son. By this point, Henry had already taken on a new mistress, a woman by the name of Jane Seymour, and he was just simply looking for a way to rid himself of Anne. On May 2nd, 1536, Anne was arrested and charged with adultery, incest, and high treason. On May 17th, she was executed. Literally the day after Anne's execution, Henry declared his engagement to Jane Seymour. They were married just 10 days later. All of this took place less than 6 months from Anne's miscarriage of what would have been the next heir to the throne. On October 12, 1537, Jane Seymour gave birth to a son by the name of Edward. However, Jane died just 12 days later of complications stemming from the birth. Henry would marry 3 more times, but bear no more children before he himself died in 1547. On his death, his then 9-year-old son Edward was crowned King Edward VI. Unlike his father, Edward had not been raised in strictly Catholic traditions, and in fact had been largely educated in Protestant theology. Whereas his father's changes to the church generally kept to Catholic traditions and teachings while replacing the Pope with the king as the final authority, Edward's reign pushed more toward Reformation teachings. Edward's Council of Regency published a new Book of Common Prayer in 1549 that banned many traditional Catholic religious practices such as processions and pilgrimages. Commissioners were sent out to remove some of the symbols of Catholicism as well. This did lead to religious uprisings and opposition, but the reforms were relatively moderate, particularly when compared to similar Reformation movements in mainland Europe. Most of the popular Catholic celebrations and traditions remained, and the changes like allowing priests to marry were adding benefits rather than removing them, and as a result, the uprisings were relatively manageable. In 1552, a second Book of Common Prayer was released, moving the Church slightly further, but still preserving traditions such as sacramentals, blessings, and vestments. This relatively moderate and incremental reformation had opponents saying it both went too far and not far enough. But again, by comparison to the literal religious wars breaking out on the European mainland, these conflicts were relatively mild. But a major problem for the Reformation movement would arrive the following year. In February of 1553, when he was just 15 years old, Edward became seriously ill. By June, it was believed he was on death's door, and there was great fear there would be a succession crisis. The next in line to the throne was his older half-sister Mary, Catherine's daughter and a devout Catholic. From his deathbed, Edward attempted to order that his first cousin, once removed, Jane Grey, succeed him rather than either of his half-sisters, Mary or Elizabeth. And 4 days after Edward's death, Jane was proclaimed queen by forces that were loyal to Edward. But Jane's claim was quite weak. By law, his oldest sister Mary's claim to the throne was clear. She was the only living child of Henry and Catherine, and despite Henry's attempts to invalidate her birth and his marriage to Catherine, Mary was the oldest living child. Those in power feared Mary would undo all of the reforms of Henry and Edward and restore the Catholic Church, and it was a very reasonable fear. But it should also be noted that Mary's doing so was also quite reasonable. History has often been very unkind to Mary, but let's take a moment to consider her point of view. Mary and her mother were not only devout Catholics, but Mary's family was so invested in Catholicism that her grandparents literally initiated the Spanish Inquisition. And the original reforms to the Church of England were largely created to invalidate her mother and herself. Why would she support any of these reforms? Mary saw anti-Catholic forces once again conspiring against her. By law, she was queen. Her father had renounced the Pope to be able to declare her a bastard, but she remained a Catholic, loyal to the Church, and from her point of view, this would be a chance to finally have the power to right the wrongs. 2 days after Jane was declared queen, Mary had assembled a military force loyal to her and indicated she was prepared to fight. Support for Jane collapsed almost immediately, and Jane and her chief supporter, the Duke of Northumberland, were imprisoned. On August 3, 1553, Mary rode triumphantly into London, accompanied by her half-sister Elizabeth, and Mary was declared the new Queen of England. Given almost all of Edward's court had been involved in attempting to plot to keep her from power, there were few she could trust, and so a purge followed. Mary initially issued a proclamation that she would not compel her subjects to convert to Catholicism, but still many Protestant reformers fled. Mary's first parliament made valid once again the marriage of her mother and father and abolished most of Edward's religious laws restricting Catholic practices. Some of the popular reforms were also rescinded. For example, the rules requiring priests to be celibate were reinstated, meaning those who had married during that time were no longer able to receive benefits as priests. Mary sought to negotiate with Pope Julius III to bring England back into the fold, but one of his conditions was that the old heresy acts be revived. This meant that despite her early proclamations that she would not require her subjects to convert back to Catholicism, that was a lie. As a result, nearly 300 people were executed refusing to renounce Protestant teachings, most of them being burned at the stake. Mary also faced a succession crisis. When she became queen at the age of 37, she was unmarried and had no children. In July of 1554, she married a Catholic leader who was also a distant cousin, Philip II of Spain. This marriage was unpopular for many reasons. Philip could not read or speak English, and it was clear Philip's loyalty was to mainland European interests and not England. Philip's clear ambitions were to have England annexed as part of a larger empire with control centered in mainland Europe, and Mary had ceded to him more or less co-equal authority to rule. As Mary became more and more unpopular, insurrection movements emerged to attempt to depose her in favor of her half-sister Elizabeth. While these movements failed, Elizabeth, despite denying any involvement, was imprisoned in the Tower of London, just as her mother Anne Boleyn had been. After 2 months in the Tower, she was released to house arrest, but was restricted in her movements and contacts. In September of 1554, Mary stopped menstruating. She felt nauseated in the morning, and everyone more or less believed she was pregnant, to the point that even Elizabeth was released from house arrest and allowed to come to court to witness the birth of the heir to the throne. But no child came. It turned out to be a false pregnancy. In the years that followed, Philip was away much of the time, leaving England in 1555 to fight in the various wars taking place across mainland Europe. He did not return until 1557, by which time Mary was in her 40s and in failing health. Mary believed again that she was pregnant, but again she was not. It is suspected that she may have uterine cancer, which led to her symptoms and eventual death in 1558. Having no children, Mary's death meant that Anne Boleyn's daughter, Elizabeth, would become the next queen. Mary knew Elizabeth would reverse the reforms, but she did not act as Edward had before her. Instead, Mary recognized Elizabeth as her heir on November 6, 1558, 11 days before she died, assuring Elizabeth would have the transition to power she had been denied. And so, at the age of 25, Elizabeth, whose mother had been killed by her father, who had been imprisoned herself just a few years prior, became queen. Elizabeth took an approach similar to Edward in that she encouraged Protestant theological views while allowing many popular Catholic traditions to remain. Protestant leaders in exile returned, and the 5-year reign of Mary was widely condemned by them, with them giving her the moniker Bloody Mary. Not everyone agreed with the Protestant reforms, and Catholic uprisings continued, but Bloody Mary's reign had ironically weakened support by Catholicism, as it was now seen as a source of foreign influence, and many of those who went into exile or had been forced into hiding by the heresy acts had become radicalized. This is when the term Puritan began to appear. Puritan started as a derogatory term for religious radicals who sought to purify the church. Being Puritan was less about specific shared beliefs and more about unifying around opposition. In addition to being extremely anti-Catholic, they also wanted to purify the Church of England generally, removing anything they deemed outside of their reading of the Bible. The Catholic Church itself argued Elizabeth was not the rightful ruler of England, asserting the marriage to Anne Boleyn was illegitimate and she was a bastard. They argued the great-granddaughter of Henry's father, Mary Stuart, the Catholic Queen of Scotland, was the rightful queen. And on top of all of these challenges to her authority and rule, Elizabeth also had the same succession issues as those who came before, but she dealt with them very differently. Elizabeth knew if she married, no matter who she married, it would lead to additional instability and possibly imminent insurrection. So she simply didn't. Shortly after Elizabeth took the throne, the now widowed Philip proposed to her in an attempt to hold him to the throne with a political marriage. When she took her time to respond, Philip eventually pursued a different political marriage in France. This was a repeated trend with many suitors over the years. In terms of domestic politics, her remaining unmarried meant removing her would create a succession crisis, and even her enemies understood that keeping her in power was more desirable than the war that would follow, particularly for those in the Protestant court. And yet the hope of the possible marriage made foreign suitors also more likely to seek that path to ruling England rather than invasion. Her staying unmarried also created a kind of cult of personality mythology around her, the Virgin Queen. She wisely embraced all of the religious parallels that came with it and used it to unify support behind her. In international affairs, Elizabeth would argue to Catholic leaders that the Church of England was not the same as the Protestant revolutionaries they were fighting on the mainland, and more a cousin to Catholicism. And for the early part of her reign, she was able to generally keep the peace and stay out of the wars on the mainland. And Catholics were willing to wait, believing the Scottish Queen Mary would eventually either usurp or simply inherit the throne, saving them from having to invade. But the Scottish Queen became embroiled in controversy soon after she returned from France to take the Scottish crown. She became entangled in a scandal around rumors that she murdered her husband, and she was forced to abdicate the Scottish throne to her infant son James. She escaped and fled to England, only to find herself imprisoned again. 19 years after abdicating the throne, she was caught writing letters to conspirators seeking to murder Elizabeth to push her onto the throne. While it can be debated if it was entrapment or her own idea, the outcome was the same. She was found guilty of treason and beheaded in 1587. This created two serious problems. First, it set a precedent that monarchs were not above the law. Although she had been forced to abdicate the throne to her son James, she was still viewed by many, including herself, as the rightful queen. Second, Mary's son James had been raised a Protestant during her imprisonment. With Mary, Queen of Scots, dead, there was no longer a reason for Catholics to hope Elizabeth might be replaced by a Catholic ruler. Philip II, Bloody Mary's former husband, the former King of England, was now the King of Spain. His ambitions toward ruling England once again had never ceased, and Spain was the most powerful country in the world at the time. Now, he believed, was the time for Spain to invade England. But the invasion was a disaster for Spain. The failure of the Spanish Armada was seen as more or less a miracle throughout England, and cemented Elizabeth mythology as the Virgin Queen. So surprising was the victory over the Armada that many believed it only could have come as a direct intervention by God against the Catholic Church. In just 50 years, England had gone from one of the most devoutly Catholic nations in the world to having a majority in opposition to the Church. Puritans were still unhappy, but they were also aware Elizabeth had reached more or less legendary status, and that they would likely have to wait for her successor before they would be able to purify the Church of England. For now, opposition to Catholic invaders in Spain and France were the focus, as they were the immediate threat. Although no one had been officially named, Puritans had reason to believe that the likely successor to Elizabeth would be more open to Puritan reforms. King James, who had been given the throne of Scotland, had not only been raised Protestant, but had spent more than 30 years ruling over the kingdom as it became more and more anti-Catholic, in large part due to the rise of the Presbyterian Church. When James became king in 1603, Puritan leaders brought James a manifesto known as the Millenary Petition, with a list of requests for religious reforms. These included demands to remove ceremonies such as the signing of the cross at baptism, wedding rings, and strict observances of the Sabbath. James was a Protestant, but he was not a Puritan. He was very focused on affirming the divine right of rule, which he had written about even prior to becoming king, and so largely embraced his role in the Church of England over other interpretations. James declined to act on most of the Protestant requests, with the exception of the creation of a new English version of the Bible. He commissioned what we now know as the King James Bible, making sure it emphasized his beliefs around divine rights of kings, unlike other recent Protestant interpretations of the time, such as the arguably anti-royalist Geneva Bible. He further disappointed those who believed he would bring significant change when he kept most of Elizabeth's counselors, who he had been coordinating with to assure he would be chosen successor. Puritans were not happy, but Catholics still remained a large threat. For example, famously in 1605, there was an attempt by Catholic dissident Guy Fawkes to blow up Parliament. Like Elizabeth before him, James was a political survivor whose mother had been found guilty of treason and executed. Before becoming King of England, he had long navigated equally treacherous politics in Scotland, but unlike Elizabeth, he had a son who would succeed him, Charles. Charles was a child who had been raised by a father in a church that assured him his role was by divine right, rather than one who saw his own mother murdered by the state. As James approached death, his son sought alliances through marriage with Spain. In 1624, Charles went to Spain in an attempt to woo a Spanish princess, but this attempt failed spectacularly, and Charles was politically and publicly embarrassed in the Spanish court. This entire effort was viewed as incredibly unpopular by the Parliament and as heresy by the Puritans. They demanded Charles not marry a Catholic, but Charles ignored them. When James died the next year in 1625, after his father's death but before Charles's coronation, Charles married a French Catholic princess by proxy whom he had only seen in passing and never met in person. He promised the French crown he would loosen religious restrictions in exchange, but promised the exact opposite when he returned to England. When Charles was formally crowned in February of 1625, his new wife did not attend as she refused to participate in Protestant ceremonies. Charles remained a Protestant, but encouraged variations of Protestant teaching that gave more power to the Church, and therefore himself as head of Church. This put him even more at odds with Puritans, but those who expressed disagreement risked imprisonment or even having their ears removed as punishment. In 1639, rebellion broke out in Scotland over attempts to force Scotland to follow the teachings of the Church of England specifically. This was not between Catholic and Protestants, but between two Protestant groups. Because of difficulty funding this war, Charles needed to call Parliament to raise money. But Charles had burned too many bridges by this point. Parliament not only refused to raise money to support Charles, but also refused to dissolve to allow him to seek other paths to get around them for funding. Unified in opposition to Charles, who was not just king but head of the Church of England, the Puritan factions were much more sympathetic to the religious views of the rebels than to those of the king. By 1642, civil war broke out between Parliament and the king, with Parliament raising an army led by a Puritan by the name of Oliver Cromwell. Forces loyal to the Parliament, known as Roundheads, eventually defeated the Royalists, and after failed attempts at reconciliation, King Charles was captured, tried for treason, and executed on January 30th, 1649. On his execution, a republic was founded, known as the Commonwealth of England, with the Puritan general Oliver Cromwell effectively given the power of the monarchy with the title of Lord Protector. To purify is to remove perceived impurity, and it is much easier to build consensus around what is wrong than it is to agree on what is right. Since they were not in power and couldn't implement change, Puritan disagreements on what should be really didn't matter, as they could be united in dissatisfaction around what was. But once they did take power, it mattered a lot. On December 19th, 1643, Parliament passed an ordinance telling the subjects to treat the midwinter period, quote, with the more solemn humiliation, because it may call to remembrance our sins and the sins of our forefathers, who may have turned this feast, pretending to the memory of Christ, into an extreme forgetfulness of him, by giving liberty to carnal and sensual delights. In 1644, they passed an ordinance to abolish the feasts of Christmas, Easter, and Whitsun. In January 1645, Parliament made clear that festival days, including Christmas, were to be spent in respectful contemplation, not celebration. But Puritan ambition was not just for those within England and its colonies. Unlike those on the English mainland, Ireland had remained largely Catholic for the last 100 years. And so, in the lead up to the Civil War, likely seeing Charles's weakness, Catholic leaders took the opportunity to launch a rebellion to separate them from England in 1641. With the Civil War on the mainland complete, Cromwell turned his New Model army to Ireland, invading in 1649. Once having established control of the island, Cromwell sought an ethnic cleansing of Irish Catholics. He seized Catholic land for Protestant British settlers, banned Catholics from marrying Protestants or even living in many towns, and seized their food, either for England or simply to be destroyed in order to starve the Catholic populations. Estimates are that between the war and the famine, somewhere in the range of 200,000 and 600,000 Irish died. This was on an island with a population at the time of less than 2 million people. Cromwell continued to rule over England until his death in 1658 at the age of 59. His son attempted to succeed him, but having no real claim was forced to resign in 1659, and by 1660 the monarchy was restored under Charles's son. Almost immediately the laws regarding festivities such as Christmas were rescinded. Except, of course, in the New England colonies, where many Puritans had already settled, and others were now coming as refugees. Perhaps it is these Puritan refugees fleeing the Reformation who brought to America the cultural tradition of placing a rational confidence in opposition to authority without consideration of what that opposition would do if actually given power. History is awkward.